Okay, so you're all very welcome to week 3 of the What the World Needs Now course. To give you a sense of what we'll do tonight, let me just share, as usual, my PowerPoint, and it's easier to see this. Let me just rearrange things here a little bit. Great. Okay, so what we'll do tonight, the theme. Oops. The theme for tonight. Well, sorry, we'll start off with a recap of last week in the home practice. And then the theme for tonight is the problems facing our environment. So we're going to look at that, at what the problems are a little bit. I mean, I'm sure you're all probably a bit sick of hearing about them, so we won't go into them in great detail, although we'll go into them in some detail. And we'll look at maybe what you could call important conventional responses. Now, I don't mean conventional in any kind of pejorative way. It just means like things we can do generally that are not particularly Buddhist. But then in the second half, we'll look at a Buddhist response and how, like, what can Buddhism offer this conversation? And in particular, I wanted to look at the 5 liberations. So a lot of the time, our motivation for working with the environment can be panic-stricken or guilt-ridden or whatever. So I wanted to look at it much more positively in terms of the kind of freedoms that we can experience through having an appropriate Buddhist response to the environmental crisis, I guess you could say. We were discussing there in the team just what's the best word. Laura works as an environmental scientist, so we settled on the word crisis, but maybe that's a bit, if that is panic inducing, you could change it to something else. So, but I wanted to look at the 5 liberations anyway, to look at it with a positive slant, so it's not all doom and gloom. And then we'll do the usual home practice and questions as well. So to remind you of what we did last week, so last week the theme was consumerism, and we looked a bit at the waste economy and how it developed. And then we looked, like we will do this week as well, we'll look at a Buddhist response to consumerism. So we talked a bit about dukkha and craving, so recognizing that in a way consumerism, by the way, if you weren't here last week, is the idea that by buying something, by consuming something, by consuming an experience, it can make you happy, basically. It can fill the existential gap that we have inside of us. And the Buddhist response begins by recognizing that there's going to be craving, and there's different levels of dukkha, or dissatisfaction, in life. There's physical dissatisfaction, there's emotional and psychological dissatisfaction, there's even existential dissatisfaction. And we're not good with sitting with dissatisfaction, so we end up craving something to take it away or distract us. And that's where consumerism comes in, craving these things, craving these experiences. So instead, we could look at living more contentedly. We could try and live more contentedly. We could try and, live more. I'm sorry, that should say live more simply. Sorry, that should say live more simply. And then looking at contentment, looking at generosity, trying to live out of generosity, and trying to live out of a sense of things being sacred and valuable and not priceable. You can't commodify these parts of life, yeah? So that's what we did last week. And I'll come back to the home practice in a few minutes, but I thought it would be good just to spend a couple of minutes just to arrive then. I think it's good just to have a sense of what we'll do tonight and remind us of where we come from. But let's do a little bit of a body scan. And then we will do I'll remind you of the home practice, and we can go into small groups then to discuss that. Yep. Okay, so setting ourselves up, we can sit upright and alert, or we can sit whatever way is best for you. Okay. So settling into our posture, making sure we're upright and alert. Closing our eyes when we're ready. And just listening to sounds we can hear. Having a sense, even though our eyes are closed, of the world around us. The feeling of air on our skin. The sounds we can hear. Any tastes in our mouth. Anything we can smell. Any play of light on our closed eyelids that we can see. And then bringing our awareness into the body more fully. So becoming aware of the points of contact of the body with the cushions, with the chair, with the floor. Feeling our legs and our feet. Feeling our hips and sitting bones and pelvis and groin. Feeling our back, our shoulders, our shoulder blades. Becoming aware of our stomach and abdomen. Maybe breathing down deeply into the stomach and abdomen for a breath or two. The sides of our body, from our hips to our armpits. Our arms, our hands. Becoming aware of our face and our throat and jaw. Then resting down in the chest, in the heart area. Just being with the heart, being with the chest, being with the rib cage as we breathe in, as we breathe out. Drawing up air as if from the floor, from the earth, And letting go back down into the earth. And with each out breath, letting go a bit more into the support of the earth, support of the floor, the chair, the cushions. And when you're ready, then starting to broaden out your attention once more, taking in the room, the sounds, the space you're in, starting to reintroduce movement, wiggling fingers and toes. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes, bring the practice to a close. Okay. So it's good to do that, I think. Good to ground ourselves in our bodies again, particularly if we've had a busy day. So I hope that was useful. So just to remind you of the home practice from the week before we go into the small groups, I'll just share that again there. So, and maybe this is what we could, we'll have 12 minutes in the group, so this is what we could talk about. We'll have about 3 minutes each. So the home practice, read the notes if you wanted to. There was a lot in the notes. It wasn't a requirement, but you could do that. And then pay attention to your habits of consumption. What kind of stories? Well, that's another typo. That should say stories, not stores. Notice, that's kind of a funny Freudian slip. Notice stories about what's going on and look for something more positive. So what's the story you're telling yourself about how much you need this thing? And look for something more positive. So notice how you get into that. And can we live more simply and more generously this week? That was part of the homework for last week. So did you attempt to live more simply? Did you attempt to live more generously? And were we able to live from a sense of what's truly valuable for you? What would you not want to sell or put a price to? What would you even consider sacred? So were you able to live from a sense of that last week? And I was also recommending to keep your gratitude journal going. Yeah. So that's what we looked at. So why don't we go into the groups, and we'll have about 12 minutes in total. So Amy, I think it's groups of 4, and Amy will send us in now whenever. Great. Okay. So I think we're all here. So you're all very welcome back. It would be great. It would be great to hear from maybe 2 or 3 of you. If anyone fancies unmuting themselves and just saying anything they've taken away from the week, or anything they found useful during the week, or anything that struck them from last week, I'd love to hear it. I don't get to go in the groups, so for all me. But I'd love to hear from 1 or 2 of you at least, or you can type in the chat box as well if you want. So be brave, share. You don't only have to speak for a minute or so.
Hi. Sorry, Sam, you go. Yep.
Go, Sam. Yep.
Thanks, Zoom issues. Thank you. Yeah, there was just because you mentioned it, Vajrashura, there was a recurring theme in our group, or at least from my perspective, regarding the stories we tell ourselves with regards to the habits of consumption. For me, I struggled with that because it seems to be that there isn't so much a story I tell myself, but when I fall into these habits of consumption, it's generally just mindless. It's kind of, mindless, low quality consciousness activities, whether that's greasy food or mindlessly shopping things I don't need, or just binging YouTube. And I'd also discovered that with regard to the other side of a different question was, what do you hold sacred or spiritual, or what can you spend more time there, or what do you hold in those regards? I spend so little of my time in what I consider sacred, or doing those, if I could say, higher quality consciousness things like reading, meditation, things like that. So it just struck me that like the ideals I have, I spend so little time doing those things, and like to what degree can I claim ownership of that or change?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, no, that's great. So just take a note. Yeah, great, thanks, Sam. I'll remove you. So no, that's great. I mean the word really that we're talking about from a traditional Buddhist point of view for story is view, or drishti is the Sanskrit word, and really, I mean, when I say story, in some ways it can be obvious as a story that you're thinking about, but a lot of the time it's really unconscious and really, really deep down. But if you could only be aware enough, really, really deep down, there is a story that you're telling yourself. I need to do this. I need to eat my greasy food, or I can't remember what the other thing. Oh, mindlessly shop. I need to do this, or I won't be happy, or I won't be safe. And so a lot of the work in Buddhism is trying to clarify what those views are that are deep and underlying. And that often takes years and years of practice to really uproot those views. But that's what one does. One uproots those views over time. They come more and more to the surface, and you're able to see through them a bit more fully. So view is probably a better word, but it's a slightly more technical term. So I thought stories might be more approachable, but Buddhism would say there is always a view for every action, underlying all that we do, consciously do at least. And maybe consciously do is the wrong word, but under all kind of willed actions, under all kind of actions that are a choice at some deep level, there's always a story validating those or saying why you should do those. So even under that mindless eating or shopping or whatever, there is a story there is a view, but for most of the time it's very, very deep and unconscious. And so much of the Buddhist path is trying to uncover what those views and stories are, So I don't know if that's what the Buddha said very clearly, and I found very little I think it's true in my experience, although it can feel not necessarily like that. It can feel just like a purely automatic response, but it is a view there at some level. And then in terms of, I mean, I can't really add much to what you said about being sacred. We spend so little time on the valuable, on the sacred, or whatever you want to call it. And I think that that's kind of what I was getting at with Nietzsche last week. And I don't know loads about Nietzsche, but certainly since the death of God, I think people were much more religious, to use a word, back a few hundred years ago, where the sacred and the valuable would be very front and center, even in Ireland a few decades ago. Now, I'm not saying we should go back to that, because it was very flawed in its own way as well, but we've kind of thrown the baby out with the bathwater, and consumerism panders to this kind of lowest common denominator that is quite, I don't know, it's very, I can't think of a better word than base, but it's very low in some ways. And it's just very, I think what one needs is sangha around oneself. One needs spiritual community to highlight what's of real worth and to keep reminding you. So people come to the centre every week in person when we're open, and they kind of get in touch with something a bit more worthwhile, and that maintains them. It's why I work in the Buddhist Centre, so I can keep part of the reason why, at least, so I can stay in touch with that. And it's why I live with other Buddhists here in this house, so I can stay in touch with that. And I don't, and sometimes we just, we end up as much on Netflix as the next person sometimes, but it is a real challenge, actually. And yeah, it's quite a thing to do. Yeah. I mean, in a way, we could spend the whole rest of the evening on Sam's 2 points there, but yeah. Someone else was speaking there. Who was the other person want to speak up then? I don't know who it was.
Oh no, it was just Vajshura is just Kerry. I was just going to say what Sam was saying about spending little time on what's sacred, and that was it really.
No, it's true. It's true. It's kind of shocking when you look at it. And I mean, I'll come back to it a bit tonight when I'm talking about the environment. But it is a bit shocking, yeah. Just how much of the time, how much of the time do we spend on social media and pointless arguments? How much of the time do we spend consuming things? How much of the time do we, think about where our next pleasure hit is coming from? And I think that's just going to make us feel a bit empty, actually. So, I mean, meditation can be a way into that. Meditation, I think when meditation's best is when it's seen in not just as a technique for making you happier, but as part of an expression of something more meaningful. If sacred is a difficult word, just use meaningful, something more deeply meaningful. So where do you find meaning in your life? And look for more of it there. Or where might you find meaning in your life? And for me, the greatest meaning is going for refuge, is pursuing a Buddhist path, friendship, trying to serve something positive, that kind of thing, Yeah. And we get so easily overwhelmed in the world, I'm afraid. Yeah. Does anyone else want to say anything? We have time for one more. Yeah, so Julianne, I'll just spotlight you if you don't mind. Don't forget to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, excuse me, I'm only working part-time now due to health reasons, but I used to find that I used to spend a lot of time maybe watching TV and doing similar silly things. Now, I did read a lot of books and things as well, but I found since lockdown, and I through meditation as well, probably, and through some of the courses, that I'm spending a lot more of my time doing stuff that I would now consider sacred, I guess. Like, I'm spending almost all my time either in nature or doing hobbies outside of my chores and work. And the difference it's made to my happiness, my health is the same, my work is the same, my financial circumstances are the same, but just the amount of meaning that I would have in my life. And none of my projects turn out any bit, none of them are commercially viable. I wouldn't show most of it to anyone. But yeah, it's just like I sometimes say, I'm a bit like a kindergartner doing their little projects, a bit of art here, a bit of reading there. But like, it's just, yeah, it definitely makes life a lot more meaningful. And I guess in some ways it's something to be grateful for, that I am working full time, even though at the start it hit me a bit. But yeah, anyway, that's all I wanted to.
No, that's great, Julian. Yeah, and it's lovely to hear that. Yeah. Let me just mute. In a way, I think the main thing holding us back really is our sense of adventure and our courage. You know what I mean? That's what we need mainly, to just go beyond what's familiar. Don't underestimate the power of the familiar and how much of a hold it has on us. We really, really strongly stay with the familiar, even if it's a terrible familiar. The more I meditate, the more I see just how strongly attached we are to what's familiar, because we think it's safe. So we do have to go out on a limb. We do have to go out on a limb to reorientate our life, just like Julianne did there, to try and have more meaning and value in it. Okay, thanks to Sam and Julianne and I missed the other person who spoke there. Sorry, my apologies. Curry, was it? Anyways, I'm sorry about that. But anyways, thank you for speaking. It's lovely to hear, so it's not just my voice the whole way through. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit then about the environment, and then we'll go into a break. So it's going to be a bit like last week, where you get the bad news first and then the good news after the break, yeah? So just a flag. So if you're feeling like, utterly depressed in the tea break, do come back, because the second half is more positive. And there's a good bit of information here. I'm going to skip through it, actually, because I'm sure you've heard it all before, but there will be much more detail in the notes as well if you want to read through it. So let's just clarify our terms first. So I just want to share my sense of what an environmentalist is. So an environmentalist is someone who protects natural resources from pollution or destruction, either by their deeds or their words. And natural resources could be anything from life to, minerals, to animals, to plants, to fish, to birds, to the environment, to natural resources like air, fresh water, all those kinds of things. So someone who protects them from pollution or destruction, or our ecosystem would be a natural resource, you could say. I mean that very broadly now, yeah. Make no mistake that the world, as I'm sure you've all heard, is in a real crisis at the moment. And there's a real alienation from the natural world in most people's daily lives. One of the things I'm going to be recommending as home practice is trying to get more in touch with nature this week, in whatever way you can. For me, it's a little park down the way there, but there is anyway the widespread pollution of earth, skies, rivers, oceans, and so on, and our planetary system is very much being stretched to the breaking point. And carbon emissions are running out of control. So even with COVID this year, like there was a bit of a dip, but they're steadily heading back up again apparently, and we're seeing all kinds of strange weather. A bit in Ireland, but certainly what you see, like just a couple of weeks ago, there was a massive hurricane hitting, I think it was Honduras or somewhere like that. But we're seeing these huge, big 100-year storms, 50-year storms hit almost every year now in that part of the world. And a lot of our weather comes from that part of the world as well, from the Gulf and so on. And there's temperatures have risen steadily. So we're on average 1 degree warmer since the 1970s at the moment. And that might not seem much. It might even seem welcome, given how cold it's been this week. But 1 degree is that's an average over the whole world, and that's has quite an effect on the ecosystems of the world. The world is also covered by 70%. 70% of the world is covered by oceans. And I didn't realize this. I did a course a few years ago a massively online course, I think, a MOOC they're called, with the World Bank of all people. And it was very, very educational. So I can recommend, if you want to learn more about this, lots of free online courses you can do. But one of the things we're looking at is that the oceans are by far the world's largest carbon sink. So 93% of the world's carbon dioxide is stored in algae, vegetation, and coral under the sea. And the oceans, with all the carbon emissions that have been happening, the oceans have been absorbing huge amounts of carbon. And that leads to a problem, because as the water absorbs a lot more carbon dioxide, it becomes more acidic. And it's leading to widespread, dying of fish species. And I was lucky enough at one point years and years ago to see the Great Barrier Reef, and in some places almost like about half of it is gone due to bleaching because of the increased acidification of the oceans. And when coral is gone, it's gone. It takes thousands of years to grow. It's actually alive. So there's all that kind of stuff happening under the sea as well as what we see around us in the world. And water absorbs about 80 to 90% of the heat from global warming. Yeah, so water can absorb about 1,000 times as much heat as the air can. If you remember your Leaving Cert physics, it's because of the specific heat capacity of water versus air. And the other thing that it might be interesting to ask yourself, what happens to water when you heat it? Well, it tends to expand. So you got all these oceans heating up and thereby expanding as well. So between ice sheets melting and particularly sheets of ice that are on land, not already in the water, and thermal expansion is the term, we're going to see a lot of sea level rise as well. I mean, the sea levels have already risen since the early 90s by about 9 centimeters. So that's about that much maybe. You probably have no scale on a computer screen, but that might not seem much, but it is quite a lot. If that's an average. And if you live by the sea, you might have noticed that, but certainly it's going to keep rising as well. The Paris Climate Change Agreement that we're all trying to get people to sign up for, that governments are trying to sign up for, are trying to limit seawater level rise to 1 meter or 2. So they're trying to limit it to that, to 1 meter or 2. So, imagine Dublin and large parts of Dublin with a sea that's a metre or two higher. Be quite problematic. And back in the, I can't remember, was it the 80s when we had the hole in the ozone? I think it was the 80s. 1,700 very prominent scientists wrote about the problem of the ozone layer. And that's been going on the whole very well, the response to that. But like in the last couple of years, tens of thousands of scientists have been speaking out about the climate catastrophe. And just trying to highlight some of the problems. Just huge amounts of reductions of fresh water available to people. It's dropped by over a quarter, the amount of fresh water available. I have friends who live in India. A large part of our order and community is in India, about a third of our order there. And they're facing the situation where the monsoons might no longer come down from the Himalayas. And that would be really, really problematic in terms of huge swathes of India, for example. We've seen human population rise by about 35% in the last couple of decades. And the number of mammals, reptiles, fish, birds, amphibians in the world has fallen in the last 25 years by 30%. So huge amounts of kind of destruction of all that. So we're in a crisis. And I say that smilingly, but I'm kind of, it is really, really serious. And, as is often the case, well, this is going to cause a lot of suffering. You know what I mean? I think it's going to cause a lot of suffering down the line. And it already is indeed. I mean, one of the, like what we're already starting to see is climate refugees. A lot of the people who are coming across the Mediterranean, it is because of war zones in the Middle East and so on. But a lot of that was contributed to by ecological change due to increased heat and farming no longer being viable in areas, so people moving to cities, and those cities being, the structures not being able to hold those people, and all kinds of problems breaking out. So there will be suffering, and there is suffering already. But the other thing is that the people who have contributed the least to carbon emissions will likely be the people to suffer the most. So the sea level rises at the equator will be a lot bigger than the sea level rises at northern and southern longitudes, isn't it? Latitudes. I'm sorry, latitudes. Yeah, I think it's latitudes. Anyways, further north or further south from the equator, you'll be less affected. So the people living on the equator, by and large, tend to be living in much less developed countries who can respond much less creatively and have much less money to respond to sea level rises. And the top 1% of the world's wealthiest people, so the richest 1%, and you're in the richest 1% of the world if you earn more than 80,000 a year. So if you earn more than 80,000 a year, you're in the top 1% of the world. So if you're in the top, if you're in the top 1% of the world's riches, I'm definitely going to ask you for a donation later. But also, you produce 175 times as much carbon as the poorest 10%. So I'm not saying that as a blame thing. I'm just saying that's how we tend to live. Basically, when you have money, you tend to live in that way. So, the people who have caused this the least are probably going to be the people who suffer the most, like in India as well, if the crops fail because of lack of monsoons and so on. But even here in Dublin, I mean, I find myself walking through like places like Ball's Bridge, where I visit my partner, and or Sandymount, where I used to live, and I live up in Drumcondra now. I'm kind of thinking, God, I wonder will all this be underwater in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, and or at least parts of the year it'll be underwater, and my sense is that a good bit of Dublin will probably be underwater. And if you're from Cork or wherever, Galway, I'm sure things will be somewhat similar there. So it is definitely going to affect us. And some models have it much, much worse than that. I mean, there's worrying. I'm of a scientific background, by the way. My background is theoretical physics, so I've tried to educate myself around this as well. But there are some concerns about the Greenland ice shelf melting, and that's ice that's not already in the sea, so it will directly cause the waters to rise. Like if you put ice cubes in water, they rise the level of the water. But if you have ice cubes in water and they melt, they don't raise the level of the water. and a lot of the sea ice already is in water. But anyways, so it's a serious situation that I think we need to take well seriously. But yeah, so you've probably heard all this before, you know what I mean? And I don't say this to make us feel depressed or overly alarmed or guilty or anything like that. I think those kinds of responses, like I talk about in week 1, are just not helpful, really. They're just not helpful. Slipping into despair is just not helpful. And yeah, I've been seeing reports lately that so many teenagers and younger people are just so anxious about this whole area. You know, what kind of world are they going to grow up in? And I just think that's not going to help anyone. So I don't want people to get anxious, but I do want us to try and think about it and see what can we do to help, you know. And I'm going to suggest some ways. Now, I'm really not an expert, even though I've studied it a bit. And Laura's an environmental scientist and works in this area as well. But I mean, in some ways, I think, we'll go into things we can do. But like I said in week 1, I don't think any of us on our own are going to solve or destroy the earth. You know what I mean? Solve the problem or destroy the earth. But there's definitely things we can do. I want to talk point out a few things that we may well have heard before. We likely heard before, more kind of conventional responses. I just mean by that, like, things that you will have heard that aren't particularly Buddhist. And really, a lot of it is to do with reducing our carbon footprint, taking responsibility for our actions. So that is a core part of Buddhism, taking responsibility for our actions. And the effects of our actions. So, we're trying to reduce our fossil fuel usage. So there's loads of things we can do, which will have an effect, I think. And the more we do these kinds of things, the more it'll have a pressure beyond us. Really, I think it needs much wider systematic change than what we do ourselves. But the more we do, the more that'll affect systematic change in the culture around us. So there's lots of different things you can do. I'll talk a bit more in a few minutes about how we eat, going vegetarian, going vegan. That's one of the biggest things you can do in terms of reducing your carbon footprint. I've just discovered a 100% renewable energy company, so I'm going to be trying to convert the centre to that, and maybe our house as well. Once we're out of contract, I can send the link to that in the notes. You might like to consider getting solar panels. Every time I open up any social media now, I've got 5 ads for social panels, they do make a difference. Moving home, to move your house if you rent or even if you own a house, to reduce your travel needs. Try and cycle more. Live in a smaller house. Live communally. I think living communally with other people is a really important thing to do. You reduce your wastage and your consumption massively by living together. I think we will need to live together more in the future. Generally, not just Buddhists. Reduce your use of your waste. Recycle more. Buy local food. Divest from fossil fuels in your bank, your business, your college. My partner was just researching ethical pensions. You can get ethical pensions now from. There's a ethical broker she's been with which won't invest in any fossil fuels or ornaments or anything like that. So a lot of fossil fuel companies are kept going by people's pensions and investments. I know that there's ethical investments as well you can make if you have money sitting in a bank. And then just, travel, fly only when absolutely necessary. This is an interesting one for me and under Buddhists, because usually you might go to the UK to train for ordination or go on retreats. So you have to work out. It's not that you want to have to feel like you live in a cave somewhere and kind of live off raw potatoes and stuff like that, and feel guilty for farting and things like this, for contributing emissions to the environment. But I think we have to decide where, we have to live, but we also have to take on the consequences of that. So it's about working that out, yeah. I don't think that, having said all that, I mean, they're all really important, but I think something deeper is needed than all that, though, and they're all in the notes, by the way. So you can read more about those in the notes again. They are important, but I think something deeper is needed. I think a change of mind is needed, a deep-seated turning around in our minds in terms of radically changing how we live, and and I think Buddhism is always really clear that Buddhism starts with the mind. Change starts with the mind. And by mind I mean mind heart. So I think what I'd like to propose in the second half is a radically, well, hopefully radically, a way of radically changing how we look at things. And I think we've already been doing this a bit. Last week, again, I was just really struck by what a radical act, looking for value and sacredness, living simply, living generously, is when living in a very consumer society. I think that's a really radical act, actually, that has far-reaching consequences for us, especially in our minds and our hearts. So that's the kind of change I'd like to see us do, because, I think there's a lot of, it's called kind of greenwashing. There's a lot of things that we're encouraged to do just to make us feel better about things that don't really change things very much. I get infuriated by ads in my social media as well from Shell encouraging me to recycle more, and it's just complete pants, to be honest. You know what I mean? Even people, there was a study done in Germany a couple of years ago that found that even people who consider themselves very, very pro-environmentally and very aware, they tend to emphasize actions that have relatively small effects. So they surveyed over 1,000 people, and the main predicator of someone's carbon emissions wasn't whether or not they considered themselves living environmentally friendly or not. It was whether they were wealthy or not. And I'm not being down on wealth or anything like that, but basically it's very easy in the modern world, and actually we're encouraged by vested interests to, okay, so we're flying to Spain for the weekend, but that's okay because I've recycled my plastic today. You know what I mean? I'm using a lot of plastic, but at least I'm putting it in the bin, for recycling. I'm sure you can think of other ones as well. Yeah, I'm eating meat, but it's organic. I'm driving a big car, but I'm offsetting my emissions. So those kinds of things really, I don't think, make enough of a difference. And I think one of the best environmentalist writers about this, from a secular point of view, is the Guardian's George Monbiot, if I'm pronouncing his name right. Now, he's a very good writer. I've almost had to stop reading him because it's so depressing at times, his stuff. I'm sure some of you are familiar with him. But he makes the comment that green consumerism, material decoupling, sustainable growth, all are illusions designed to justify an economic model that's driving us to catastrophe. The current system, based upon private luxury and public squalor, will immiserate us all. Under this model, luxury and deprivation are one beast with two heads. So we need a different system, rooted not in economic abstractions, but in physical realities. We need to build a world in which growth is unnecessary, a world of private sufficiency and public luxury, and we must do it before catastrophe forces our hand. So there's two things there that really strike us. The current system is based upon private luxury and public squalor. And he says we need to move instead to private sufficiency and public luxury. Now, maybe there's a trace of Marxism in that might put you off, but I think what he's talking about, like private sufficiency, is coming from that state of inner abundance, primarily, for me at least. Maybe, I'm not sure if that's what he means, but feeling a feeling of contentment, of inner generosity, of an abundance, inner, so that we don't need to feel this, we need things, and also public luxury. So I think what he means by that is kind of what he would mean like better public transport systems, better sense of community in towns and cities and so on, which I totally agree with. But also I think he means just like a sense of connection. Well, from my point of view, I would argue a sense of connection, a sense of community, a sense of us being together and feeling the abundance of that, rather than the public. I think we live in very atomized worlds these days, and less so in Ireland, but it's heading that way, where we all live our own lives in our own little flat or whatever. And I think that is a kind of, to use his term, a certain type of public squalor or a public impoverishment. So I think we need more of a public impoverishment, a public enriching that comes from connection and community. And it's only, like I said in week one, it's only through working together that we can ever really change anything, I think. I think it's fine to take responsibility for your own carbon emissions, but until there's much wider systematic change, I think the oil companies are just going to be laughing all the way to the frying pan that the world is going to turn into, you know. So I think we need to, you know, connect and live together as a community in whatever way, that in the broadest sense of that term, and come from there. I'm not sure what the exact solutions will be, but there's so much creativity out there. There's so many good things happening that you can see if you just go out and look. Okay, so maybe I'll stop there and we'll have a little bit of a tea break, and I'll come back with the more Buddhist response then. I mean, I've kind of started talking about the Buddhist response. The Buddhist response is always a response to suffering, basically. Buddhism makes you really happy as well, I think. It's made me very happy and feel very satisfied, and it's brought meaning into my life. But the Buddha was always really clear that the reason we practice Buddhism or the Dharma is because there is suffering, ourselves and other people suffering. And he said he teaches Buddhism, he teaches suffering and the end of suffering. So the reason I practice Buddhism is because I want to end suffering, my own and other people. And the end of suffering is the joy that arises, is the meaning that arises. So Buddhism is always a response to suffering. And I think environmentalism is highlighting the potential and actual suffering that is arising. So in a way, the Buddhist response is like the Buddhist response has always been, it's a response to suffering in the world. So that's what I want to explore after the tea break. So why don't we take a break for 10 minutes? If you have any questions, you can stick them in the chat in the meantime, or do go and stretch your legs. So why don't we be back ready to go at 8:15, if that's okay. So 8:15, I'll see you in 10 minutes. Just to remind you again that the as I do every week around this time, that hang on a second. That you know, the course has been offered on a completely free basis, a donation basis. So if you're in a position to give a donation, that would be much appreciated, because it'll help us keep going. It'll help us to keep offering the Dharma. It'll help us keep offering meditation to people. Your money will be very well spent in terms of just keeping the centre going, to offer what we're offering you guys tonight, and much more of that. So Amy's put the link in the chat box there. So what I'd recommend is if you can give a donation, click on the link and leave it open in the background, and come back to the Zoom call, and you can give the link at the end, or you can give the donation when the course ends. I'll remind you again at the end. Excuse me. Okay, so just to go on then to the second half of the night. So I want to say a little bit more, and then we'll go back into groups as well to discuss what we want to do then in terms of the home practice and so on. I'll try and give us a bit more time at the end this week for groups, because we probably have responses to some of the stuff we've talked about. It might be good to hear what your response to this stuff tends to be as well, in terms of, oh God, I'm just not going to worry about that right now, or oh, I'm really active, or I don't believe in this, or whatever, you know, or I feel despair, or I feel inspired. It'd be good to hear that as well. Okay, so where let's start. Let's start with the Buddha. So the Buddha is always good to start with, yeah. So the Buddha, I mentioned this last week, but the story that we have of the Buddha is that he grew up in a palace. He grew up as a son of a local ruler of a local kingdom or a republic. It's not completely clear, and he was quite wealthy and lacked for nothing. But he had to eventually leave the palace and live as a homeless wanderer for years, meditating himself in the jungle, learning from different people, and eventually on his own gaining enlightenment. And I think we have to leave the palace as well. I mentioned this last week as an image. We have to leave the security, the enjoyment, the privilege that our own conventional habits tend to bring. Now, I don't necessarily mean that we need to go and live as homeless wanderers, but we do need to take stock of what we have and be able to let go of it if it's no longer useful either to us or to the world around us. So, no palace is completely secure. So we probably know at some level that we're going to have to let go of it at some point anyway. And also, we can be aware that our palace is built upon the suffering of others. Like, I remember I was chatting to a friend of mine who drove through China. He was touring there with his orchestra, and he said they drove through one of these industrial cities where all of our electronics are built, and it was like a hellscape. He said, it was horrible to see. It really shook him. So we need to leave our familiar palaces maybe and try and change, basically try and behave differently. And I wanted to suggest this in as positive way I can as possible by talking about what one Buddhist friend of mine calls the 5 liberations. So the 5 liberations. So Buddhism is all about liberation. It's all about freedom. It's all about being free from what restricts us, from what makes us suffer, from what holds us back, from conflict that's within us. It's lovely to be free of negative states of mind. It's lovely to be free of things that weigh upon us. So seeing things in terms of joy and freedom rather than doom and gloom. So this is from an order member called Akupa, who has done a lot of work in this area. So let me just share that document again. So let's just go through these quickly. Okay, so give me 1 second here. Okay, good. So the 5 liberations. So I'll just go through these one by one and say a little bit about each of them. Some I'm going to say more about. So the first liberation is the liberation that comes from not harming life. So when we feel like we're harming life through our lifestyles, through our habits, through our consumption and so on, that very easily weighs upon us. That very easily weighs upon us. And there's a freedom from remorse that comes, a freedom from kind of, there's a freedom that comes at least when we feel like we're eating, we're living, we're consuming more wisely or more kindly. Yeah. And one of the big ones, one of the main areas here I want to talk about is eating more kindly. So I want to do a bit of a spiel, if you'll forgive me, about becoming more vegetarian or becoming more vegan. Yeah. And I have to say, I mean, it's not particularly, much of what I'm going to say isn't particularly Buddhist, but it's very much rooted in the Buddhist tradition. The Buddha himself wasn't actually vegetarian, you might be surprised to hear, because he had a rule that, his monks and nuns used to go around begging for their food in bowls. And the rule was you had to accept whatever was put into the bowl, because you didn't want to cause offense to people, or you didn't want to, you couldn't be fussy basically, because you didn't want them to get into, well, I'll go to that house there and not that house. And, but he was quite specific that you weren't to allow someone to kill an animal specifically to feed to you. So he did, and he talked a lot about not harming animals. And I think I said this in week 1, that his practices led to a widespread abandonment of animal sacrifice. So you had to eat whatever was put in your bowl. And there is a story that I'll just mention that's not relevant to anything we're covering tonight, where one of his followers is Kashyapa is being given food from a leper, and the leper's finger falls off and falls into the bowl. So he has to eat it. But anyways, that's a whole other thing. We won't be asking you to do that, don't worry. In fact, we're asking you not to consume flesh in this one. So you might like to ask yourself, in terms of your eating patterns, does this food come from the flesh of an animal? Did this food cause animal suffering or other secondary suffering through carbon emissions? So I don't think anyone can be absolutist here. I have a friend who's an order member who has to eat meat for health reasons, but I think we could all move towards being more vegetarian or more vegan. There's a lot, like, just environmentally speaking, in terms of carbon emissions, it makes so much sense to do this. So it takes about 13 and a half times as much carbon emissions to produce a kilogram of beef as a kilogram of peanut butter or tofu or dried beans or broccoli. So 13 and a half times. It takes 39 times as much emissions to produce a kilogram of lamb as a kilogram of lentils. So 39 times. And I mean, I know it's not always as simple as that, because you can have sheep in areas that you can't grow crops and things like this, but it's certainly, meat is very agriculturally intensive. And also, producing meat is hugely it's hugely responsible for destruction of habitats and deforestation. So there's a huge boom at the moment in China on meat, on beef in particular, and that's leading to a worldwide surge of soya prices. And most of the deforestation that you hear about in the Amazon is for soya, because soya is the best way that we have of helping animals pile on the pounds, basically, so that we can eat those animals. So the soybeans in the Amazon isn't for your soy milk, it's for beef, So, and maybe we don't eat that kind of beef, maybe Ireland's a bit better, but I think some of the feed that comes in probably is. And if you eat any kind of mass-produced chicken that isn't produced in Ireland, it's probably been fattened up on beef and so on soya and so on. And the WWF estimates that an area 1.5 times the size of the European Union would be saved if there was a big reduction of animal products like that. And they reckon that excessive animal production, excessive food for animals basically, is responsible for about 60% of all biodiversity loss. So it's a huge, huge thing. And one of the best things you can do in terms of positive action is to move towards vegetarianism or veganism. And even in Ireland, there's a lot of suffering involved. So I grew up on a farm, and we had our own cows and all that kind of stuff. And I don't know if you've ever seen cows these days. They're so selectively bred for milk that it's almost painful for some of the breeds like Friesians to walk. So there is a lot of suffering involved in milk, for example, and you hear terrible reports of chicken farms and things like that. And I won't go into the horribleness that you see in those situations. Conveyor belts, crushers, big vacuum cleaners, all this kind of thing to suck them up. And also there's a huge amounts of antibiotics put into our meat, because if you give animals antibiotics, they put on meat faster. So they're given loads of antibiotics, which many doctors are very worried about in terms of antibiotic resistant strains of disease down the line, where like the way they're talking, I was reading the other day that even like regular operations like hip replacements or cesareans might become suddenly deeply life-threatening for people because of antivirus resistant bacteria. And also, to put it more positively, I mean, animals like chickens and pigs and so on are incredibly sociable and gregarious and like to range. And, some of the conditions they live in is terrible. So, and it's not just meat as well. It might be, part of this might be looking at, well, do you really need apples from New Zealand, or fresh tomatoes grown in a chemical bath in Spain in December and things like this? Anyway, so they're all things to ask about. Now, I think the maybe what the Buddha could bring, the Buddhist perspective on this, is just doing that as a really positive expression of love rather than out of guilt. So I no longer want to cause harm to animals because I love animals. You know what I mean? And it's from there that I feel like I want to become a vegetarian and become more vegan. I'm not fully vegan, but I'm getting almost there. But yeah, thanks for that, Elaine, in the comments. So, like, I think we need to do it out of a positive vision of things and live in a way that connects us with life around us, rather than we feel a certain kind of unease about, if you see what I mean. So it doesn't have to be all or nothing, but maybe we could be a little bit more vegan or a little bit more vegetarian this week. So that's the first one. And there's lots of different ways we could talk about the freedom, the liberation that comes from not causing harm. I mean, if you cause harm, you're causing yourself harm. You know what I mean? So there's a lovely freedom that comes from knowing that you're not causing harm. And I don't mean a smugness, I mean a genuine feeling of connection and happiness. Okay, so the next liberation I'm going to spend less time on, and that's the liberation that comes from giving and sharing. So I mentioned this last week, but giving and sharing and being more communal is a way of, it undermines the notion that we're all just out for ourselves. The economic model is that we're all out for ourselves. We're all fundamentally self-interested. If we're all self-interested, the invisible hand of the market will take care of everything. And that's as much of a ridiculous religion as any other religion I've heard, in a way, to have that belief. I mean, the market does drive a certain kind of creativity and so on, But I think we don't need to worry about that in a way. The market will be there for a long time to come. But try and see things in terms of sharing, giving, generosity, and so on. And there's a freedom that comes from living from giving, rather than just being aggrieved about not getting enough. When you think in terms of getting, you very easily move into not getting enough, or getting the wrong things, or that person stopping you from getting what you want. But if you think in terms of giving, it's a much more liberated way to be. Okay, so the third one then is the liberation that comes from living a simple life. And maybe you've already been seeing this week, because we did talk about this last week. There's a liberation that comes from living simply. And, one of the most effective things we can do is to live simply in the face of the environmental catastrophe, or crisis, or whatever we want to call it. If we can live simply, living simply, as I mentioned last week, is not about living in denial of any kind of joy or happiness. It's about living in such a way that we allow what's truly important to come to the fore. Yeah. So when we live simply, we see what's really important. And we can't quite do this right now, but I think being on retreat is a really good way on a Buddhist retreat is a really good way of seeing just how simply we can live. I've been on 2 4-month retreats. They're the longest ones I've done. My own ordination retreat back in 2007. And I was helping run an ordination retreat last year. And you kind of just have your suitcase, basically. And you live really simply. You don't have your phone on. You're living in nature. You're living up a mountain, basically, in Spain. And it was just really striking just how simply one can live and how happily one can live. And you might not be ready to go off on a 4-month ordination retreat, but you can go on retreat typically, or at least we will be able to offer retreats again. And they're really eye-opening experiences to how simply one can live and how little one actually needs to be happy. So really, again, encourage you to try and live simply this week. And the Buddha was very clear about the beauty of a simple living. Really, really clear about the beauty of that. And I'll remind you of Sangharakshita's quote that I mentioned last week. The truly simple life glows with significance, for its simplicity is not the dead simplicity of a skeleton, but the living simplicity of a flower or a great work of art. So the living simplicity of a flower, so simple and beautiful. And to quote George Monbiot, who's the environmentalist and writer, journalist I mentioned earlier, he says, "By living lightly, we enrich our lives. By living lightly, we enrich our lives." So I like that idea of living lightly, not pressing too hard on the earth as we walk, walking in beauty. So beauty is a really good way into this, and contentment. And it's one of the main things I think we need to do. Okay, so I have 2 more. These are loosely based, by the way, on the 5 ethical guidelines, if you're familiar with those in Buddhism. So they're the first 3 there. So if you're familiar with the 5 precepts, they're based upon the 5 precepts. Okay, so the next one then is the liberation that comes from speaking the truth. So I'm not going to say loads about this, ironically, but I think what this is about, there's lots of different things here, but it's about highlighting that in order to be happy and to be free, we do need to speak out for what we believe in. Yeah. And I think if more and more people could speak out in terms of at least their concerns at the very least, but also giving voice to our connections and our appreciations, we would live in a much richer place that would be freer and the world being a better place. And also, I mean, maybe that needs to be quite dramatic, like, protests at Standing Rock against, oil pipelines and things like that. But maybe it's about giving voice to our sense of connection with life and, talking to each other about what we aspire to and, checking in next week, coming back next week to check in about how you get on with being more vegetarian and being able to speak out about that, so being able to speak the truth. Ultimately, to speak the truth means to live by the truth, and then you can speak from that place. Yeah. So our actions should agree with what we feel and what we speak. Yeah. And then the last one is the liberation that comes from awareness and understanding. So it comes from awareness and understanding. And there's two parts to this. I want to talk about connecting with nature as an end in itself and seeing the universe as alive. Yeah. So, and this is the last thing I want to say. I know I've talked for a bit now, but and you can read all these in the notes. So we do live in a time where there's almost a pathological disconnection with nature, and we see nature as dirty and to be washed off us when we come in, for example, and so on. I'm not saying don't wash your hands and all that kind of stuff, but you know what I mean? I think we need to have a deeper and stronger connection with nature and feel positively part of it rather than more of an observer in it. So we need to feel positively part of it so that we will be nourished by it. So I want to read out a quote by Sangharakshita, the founder of our community, about the attitude we need to have to nature. And I really, really like this quote, so I'll just read it out. So what we need, basically, is an aesthetic attitude to nature, even the contemplative attitude to nature. There's no question of using nature. There's no question of doing anything with nature. You leave nature alone. You simply look at nature. You simply see nature. Here, nature is simply appreciated for her own sake, enjoyed for her own sake, whether we are looking at a mountain, whether we are looking at the vast expanse of the sea, or whether we are looking at a tiny flower or just at a grain of sand. There is no need to idealize nature or romanticize nature, much less to sentimentalize it. But there is no doubt that the appreciation of nature, especially of great natural beauty, can play an important part in the spiritual life. It can have a very soothing, very calming, even a restorative effect. So think of ways this week that you can connect with nature. Sit out in the back garden. We don't need much nature to connect with, put out a bird feeder and look at the birds. That's one of my favorite ones. And you just see the vividness of life when you look at a bird feeder and the birds coming and going to it. It'll probably take them about a week or two to discover it, but then it's a great thing to do. So it's better than television, I have to say. Or go for walks in your local park, or if you're in the countryside, go down to the sea, or whatever you need to do. So connect with nature. And unless we have a connection with nature, we won't really want to do much about helping nature, I think. So we need to be connected. And this is all part of the liberation that comes from awareness and understanding. The other one then is a bit more tricky to describe. And this is seeing the universe as alive. So we need to be open to natural beauty and the connection. And we need to, I think the fundamental scientific materialist position since the Enlightenment in Europe has been that the universe is fundamentally dead matter. Yeah. And we are kind of specks of life within this dead matter. And as a result, then it leads to a utilitarian attitude towards nature, to be exploited. And this very much came out of the Industrial Revolution as well, to exploit nature to its fullest. But we need to really change our mindset around that. And I think this is one of the most important ones, actually, of the five, of the different areas we've talked about. So we need to see the universe as alive, as a living kind of system, you could say, the world, but also the whole universe as alive and having purpose and meaning, you could say. And don't worry too much about the literal truth of whether that's literally true or not. I think we need to see Sangharakshita has talked about it in terms of almost having a more pagan attitude to things, That doesn't necessarily mean believing in fairies and down the back of the garden and stuff. Although, if you want to, if that brings things more to life for you, then fine. You know what I mean? In some ways, I think you'd be better off with that. In some ways, than being a really hard materialistic, scientific materialistic attitude. So having a sense of life and color and richness in the world, and a sense of connection with it. And if we see the universe as alive, we will cherish beauty. We will cherish preserving what's beautiful. We will cherish the sacred, to touch back into that idea again. We can see life as sacred. We can see life as being bigger than any one of us, and that we live in a very deeply connected web of life. It's a very traditional image in Buddhism that all beings in the universe are like this huge web, where we're all, it's like we're part of this huge big web. It's called Indra's web in Buddhism, where every part of the web, every node of the web is a being, and every being is connected to every other being in this huge web of light. And it's used as a metaphor for things, for the world, by some Buddhist teachers, and it's a very beautiful one. But we also have the idea of I guess in more modern times, Gaia, or a kind of an alive earth and alive universe. So we need to look at our views around this, our stories, to come back to what we were talking about earlier. So do we fundamentally see the earth as something dead and to be exploited? Or do we see it as something wonderful, amazing, sacred, Can we, one of the places I get this, and it's harder to do this now, is to go out at night somewhere dark with no light pollution and look at the stars. You know what I mean? And what an amazing universe it is, and how big and amazingly huge it is, So I just wanted to do another reading, and I'll tell you who it is afterwards. A human being is part of the whole, called by us universe. We experience ourselves, our thoughts and feelings, as something separate from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and affection for a few people closest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion, to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. The true value of a human being is determined by the measure and the sense in which they have obtained liberation from the self. We shall require a substantially new manner of thinking if humanity is to survive. So the writer there, he talks about an optical delusion of consciousness, where we see ourselves here and the universe out there. And he says that our task is to free ourselves from this prison by expanding out our circle of concern, our circle of compassion, to embrace all living beings and all nature in its beauty. The true value of a human being is determined by the measure and the sense in which they have obtained liberation from the self. So that wasn't a Buddhist teacher. That was Albert Einstein, a scientist. So he was very keenly aware of the issue. Albert Einstein was decades ahead of his time in some ways. There's lots and lots and lots of fake Albert Einstein quotes out there, by the way. But that is a real one. He's been ascribed to saying everything, I think. But that is a genuine quote from him. So he's saying that we need to free ourselves of the prison of self, basically. That's very much the viewpoint of Buddhism. That if we can let go of our preoccupation with self, we will naturally identify with all life. Yeah. So Sangharakshita puts it a different way. He says, or he confirms this. He says, this understanding is not scientific. It's not even philosophical. By the way, all these quotes are in the notes. So this understanding is not scientific. It's not even philosophical. Essentially, it's a spiritual understanding and consists in seeing nature as she really is. Nature is the wheel of life, a living, perpetually recurrent process. And when we can get ourselves out of the way and our own kind of preoccupation and our own, well, traditionally it's put greed, hatred, and delusion, we will naturally identify with all. We will see the universe in this way, as alive, as precious, as beautiful. So that's the or to quote one Buddhist teacher, he says, when you recognize the empty nature, in other words, that you can't be preoccupied with self, that's just an illusion. When you recognize the empty nature, the energy to bring about the good of others dawns, uncontrived and effortless. So we will naturally want to help other people when we can get ourselves out of the way. It's fundamental to consciousness that we will want to help all beings. We'll see the universe as alive if we can get ourselves out of the way, and that'll lead us to living, having a truly creative response to the the environmental crisis, and more than that. So, yeah, so we're not doomed. I do believe that there's a lot of really interesting things happening in the world. Some Buddhist writers like Joanna Macy talks about how she thinks we're on the verge of a huge momentum shift of consciousness that we're going to be forced to do, that we're being forced to do, that people are already doing, where people will come together and live in a radically different way. And if you look back on history, there's been huge shifts in how people live and relate to things down through the years. So I think we live in, for better and for worse, very interesting times where there's tremendous scope for creativity and creative responses to what's going on. So I'm very hopeful. I'm very hopeful, I have to say. Yeah. So if you have any comments or questions, stick them in the chat. Someone asks, where does the precept from the fifth liberation arise from? So they're kind of adaptations of the 5 ethical guidelines that the Buddha gave. And the fifth precept is to avoid intoxicants and to practice mindfulness. So I think that fifth one, all of these are taken from the very positive vision, the positive version. So it comes from cultivating mindfulness. So when we apply that to the environmental crisis, it's about cultivating awareness and understanding. And the 2 ways I particularly want to draw that out there is appreciation of nature and seeing the universe as alive. Okay, I've talked enough. Let me just give you your homework, and then we'll go into groups for about 10 minutes to see how we want to see what our responses to all it is. So, so the home practice this week, read the notes if you want to. There's much more information in there. See what you can do from the list of conventional responses, reducing your carbon footprint, cycling more, all that kind of stuff, recycling, blah, blah, blah. But this week in particular, try to consume less, live more simply, continue that practice. Be more vegetarian, be more vegan. Meat-free Mondays is a big thing. Maybe try if you're not vegetarian already, maybe try being vegetarian 2 or 3 days a week, or at least for 2 or 3 meals a week. You might have to negotiate that with your family, but you won't die. I promise you won't drop dead of exhaustion or lack of nutrition. Yeah. Or if you're already vegetarian, try and be more vegan. Connect with nature and have a sense of the universe as alive. So just think about how you might connect with nature. Just see how you might be open more to the universe as alive. Be open to the poetry of existence. And poetry, if you as an analogy, if you're trying to read poetry, it's very hard to do if your life's really full. So give yourself a sense of space and openness and stay out in nature and see the universe as alive. Yeah. And then reflect upon the joy. Come at this from a positive sense of things, like seeing the liberations that arise and doing it that way. Yeah. Okay. I'm really tired of my own voice now, so I'm going to ask Amy to put us into groups, and we can see what we want to. Before you do, Amy, let me just share the home practice in the chat so people have that. Give me 1 second. Okay, so there's the home practice, maybe slightly badly formatted. Okay, Amy, so we'll be in there for 10 minutes. Great. Thanks, Jamie, for that poem as well. Okay, I think everyone's back now. Good. There you go. No, I've put it in the thing. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good. Okay, we're all back. So I hope you had a good little chat there. The evening's over, so I won't keep you much longer. Best luck with your home practice during the week, and next week we're going to look at our relationship with technology a little bit. So if you're a social media addict, next week's for you. And we're also going to look a little bit about just living in a conflict, in a troubled world in terms of conflict and that as well. So we'll look at both those areas next week a bit anyway. More technology than conflict, but we'll look at both. Okay, best of luck with the home practice.